When you see a guy with his head held high, take a look at his navy wings. Neath the coat of blue beats a heart that's true to the code of those navy wings. And as long as he flies above the sea, in our hearts a hope still clings. May he never cease to fly in peace on his mighty navy wings.
Good morning. I'm Dick Stipe, and I have with me our guest this morning is Floyd Johnny Johnson, and we're here this morning to tell you a little bit more than you might already know about the Bermuda Triangle and some of the things that have been happening there over a long period of time. And one in particular was the loss of a Navy flight, and Johnny here has first-hand knowledge of some of the information and some of the people on a first-name basis. So, Johnny, good morning.
Good morning, Dick.
I have a few questions to ask you. When did you join the Navy?
In July of 1943.
What happened after that?
I had a kind of a 30-year career, you'd say. It took full 30 years to put it in.
Okay. Where did you do your training?
My first training was at a place called Farragut, Idaho, where I took my boot camp training. And to make it short, I went from there to Aviation Ordnance School in Oklahoma, Gunnery School in Oklahoma, and then to Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Okay, but I have a question that always bothered me since we lost the Navy base here in Orlando. Was there any water in this training station that you had? Was there any ocean nearby?
There would be 3,000 miles one way and maybe 1,500 the other way.
But we didn't have any ships that went there.
Oh yeah, you always have a ship of good hope, but
Very good. Okay, where did you serve in your career? How many different places and approximately when?
In the Navy from 1943 to 1945, I was on 17 different ships and stations. I hope it wasn't because they didn't like me, but that happens to be it. We moved around a lot. I met the people that we're going to talk about on this Bermuda Triangle and Flight 19 in particular. I met those people in the flying stages in 1944 and 45.
What was your primary duty? What would you describe that as?
I was an aerial gunner on a torpedo bomber.
For the whole time? The whole 30 years?
For 3 years.
For
Either
3 years.
training for it or doing it.
Okay, now we have another 27 years to account for since we've counted for 3 years of your bomber training.
Then I spent a year and a half in Navy Reserve, inactive reserve, and I was practicing carpentry work and generally trying to get used to civilian life, and didn't like that, but I saw the Air Force break away from the Army, as the Army Air Corps broke away from the Army. I thought that might be interesting. So I joined
Would it be fair to ask you if you can still do any carpentry work, or is that kind of beyond you now?
I'd kind of like to not to let that out.
Oh, well, we don't know about that then. Okay, cancel that thought. Okay, let's get to it, Johnny. We have the Lost Patrol flight. What was the flight number?
19.
19, and this was in December 1945. What happened, and who do you know?
Okay, I'll lead into this as to how I met those people, and it really is a part of it. When I went to Fort Lauderdale, I arrived there in February of 1944. I'd finished my gunnery training, aviation ordnance training, and arrived down there as a raw recruit. I had never flown, was a seaman first class.
Ooh.
I went into barracks about 6 o'clock in the evening, laid down on a bunk, and about when darkness hit, there was also a racket outside and 3 airplanes had ran together on the runway, and of course I didn't even know where the runway was, but where the fire was the runway. Anyway, that happened. That was my indoctrination to Fort Lauderdale, and I think it was 4 men killed and out of the 9 involved, and I may be wrong on that, but it was kind of a hectic night. People running around in the darkness not knowing where they were going. I remember that as, this can't be the Navy.
Wasn't the Navy that you knew at that time, huh?
No.
Okay,
Now,
well.
From there on I went to, of course, operational training, finished that, and I want to put in some of the things that happened to me in operational training.
Okay, go ahead.
I had a a turret, for instance, people were working on the turret. Remember that we were all young people.
Working on the what?
Turret, gunnery turret.
Gunnery turrets.
That's what held one turret.
One turret.
On a torpedo
Okay,
bomber.
sorry.
And then we had a gun as a stinger, we called it, underneath. The radio operator operated a single 30 caliber weapon. Mine was a single 50 caliber in the turret on top. When we took off one day, and we didn't fire our weapons on every flight, but we did go out and practice dive bombing and glide bombing. Glide bombing is anything under 60 degrees, and dive bombing is anything over 60. And all of them are kind of interesting. When the pilot dove over for this glide bomb, the turret started to come out of the airplane with me in it. And I hollered over an interphone, and he pulled back, and we settled back down again.
Do you think we build them better these days now?
No, but I landed up in the radio operator's lap because I wanted to get out of that turret in a hurry, and I did. And we came back in. We had it checked over. We found tools in there, but we never found the owner. At least that's the story we got.
Oh, okay.
They had been working on it and forgot to redo their work. Then another time, we lost an engine on landing, really coming in about, probably 3-4 miles out, started throwing oil. And as we hit the runway, the prop stopped, and we just barely made it in that time.
You're jinxed,
But
aren't you?
we were covered with oil and all that stuff. No fire, which was good. And then the other things they practiced with us and all crews that went through there was the Dilbert Dunker. Now at Port Everglades, Florida, they had a barge out there they'd pull out of the harbor a little ways, and they had a crane on board with the fuselage of a torpedo bomber, and the crews would come out there, get in those positions on the crane, it'd swing you out over the water and drop you into the water, and that was to practice water landings. And that was quite interesting. All crews got that. So sometime in your career you probably would need that, and that was the reason they had it. Practice crash landings at sea. Then I graduated from that without too many bad experiences. I had a green pilot fly through my stream of bullets one day. I didn't hit him, but he went right through. And that wasn't funny, but it was a case of too young and too little known about the situation, too excited about what's going on. And down there, we were not experienced airmen. We were learning to be that, and that takes time.
Okay, let's move on to some of the people that you knew on this flight, or how you first gotten involved with it.
Okay, after flight training at Lauderdale, I went out and joined the crew joined a squadron in California, and we were at San Diego for a while, and Long Beach, and then Livermore, California, all the time going out practicing bomb runs on usually tankers or something like that. We learned early in life not to make a practice run on a Navy warship because they would shoot back.
They didn't understand it. They wouldn't appreciate your good training.
Something like that. Anyway, we went overseas in late September, October, 1944, and we were headed for the carrier Sangamon, but it was hit before we got there, so we went down to the fleet anchorage. Now, we weren't flying, we was on board, in that case, a crew or a troop ship, and they're not too handy at feeding you. They're even less handy at giving you something to drink.
Been there, done that.
And
Agree.
locked up on that is a lot of work, and no appreciation for airmen, of course, and we returned the favor. We got out to the fleet anchorage and finally over to Manus Island and then Los Negros Island, still looking for possibly the crew or somebody who knew about the Sangamon. It had been hit and sent back to Pearl Harbor, so we missed it completely. They put us on an island called Ponam Island. And it was a half-mile wide and a mile and a half long, and that would be a paradise in the South Pacific, and we enjoyed that. No mosquitoes, always a nice breeze blowing across the island. And everybody on Manus really envied us because we had a perfect island and they had the lousiest one in the Pacific. It was a fleet anchorage with oily, water was bad. They had Atibrine tablets twice a day. And we weren't bothered with any of that stuff. We were like tourists. And I thoroughly enjoyed that. At that time, I have to relate this because it really was tough. We had segregation in the Navy, which was truly probably a bad thing, but the Seabees that ran the island had a few of the black people in their squadron, and one day they were sitting out the runway. We were pulling sub patrol out of there and various things, but one day the radio operator wasn't flying with us, and we would go down and check out the airplane, the pilot and come back and pick it out, find the airplane, and take off and go on our tour. It wasn't bad at all. We were running our lives.
Very good.
This little black individual was sitting out alongside the runway as I came out to get in the airplane one day, and he says, "Did you fly in those?" And I said, "Oh yeah." He says, "I'd never get a chance to do that." I said, "Well, let me see. You sit here just a minute. I'll go see what I can do." And I went down and got pilots at Mr. Richter. We called our pilots Mr. in those days when they were lieutenants. All lieutenants in the Navy were called Mr. by the enlisted men up to the grade of lieutenant. And so that would be ensign, lieutenant, JG, and lieutenant would be called Mr. Then the pilot said, "Well, I think it'd be a good idea to take him along. Let's do it." And him being a good old Harvard man, he wasn't politically inclined to say no, and he was an educated man, and he said, "Johnny, you fix him up." And I'll correct that. My name wasn't Johnny in those days, it was Flip. In the Navy, you have, all the flyers seem to have a nickname, and I had the name of Flip. Now, of course, the pilot was Rick, and we called each other by those names, but you had to watch where you were when you did it. But carrying on with the young fellow we took with us. And his eyes bugged out. He looked out of the two openings to the outside, and he was smiling, and he was just so happy. We landed on the ground maybe an hour and a half later, and he said, "I'm the happiest man in the world." And I thought, well, I do that every day, and he's getting a kick out of that. Of course, it was unheard of to have blacks flying, in the Navy especially. So the next day we were down at our area was Quonset huts, and his area was tents down in the CB camp. And I heard a noise outside, and of course the blacks at that time couldn't mingle with the whites. Anyway, they had him running around the camp as a runner and as a general flunky man. But he came down to our area, and the guys were saying, "Hey, Flip, come out of your Quonset there. There's a guy out here who wants to see you. He's a black man." Oh, yeah, I went out, and he handed me a gallon jug of Coke extract. That's Coca-Cola extract. Mm-hmm. I had that for, I think, 50 men.
Was there anything else in it besides the extract?
No, just extract and water.
Okay.
But what a wonderful thing that kid
Wasn't that
did.
nice? Yeah.
Yes, to repay that. And I never saw him again. I didn't get his name, but to me that has always stuck with me.
From there, in your tour in the South Pacific, tell us how you got back to Fort Lauderdale and in touch with these folks that flew in the Bermuda Triangle.
Okay, in short, we volunteered for night torpedo training, our crew. We came back to Pearl Harbor and then Ford Island and thence to Barbers Point. At Barbers Point, I met Bob Harmon, who was he was younger than me, but right off the bat, Bob had come into service when he was 15 years old under an assumed name, and we didn't know that until a few months later after we were flying with him, training, and he told us that. What brought it forth was a GI Bill was established, and it was announced out there in the fleet that we got through the war, we'd go all get schooling if we wanted it under the GI Bill. And he said to me, he said, "Johnny, I can't get in on that." Well, I said, stupid, you sure can. What's the matter with you? He said, well, my problem is I'm not me. My real name is George Devlin, and my assumed name, I assumed it came in under the name of Robert Harmon. I used another man's driver's license, and I've been here ever since as Robert Harmon. And I said, well, you have to get that changed. And yes, we'll do that sometime. In the meantime, he says, I don't want to mix it up. But he should have, but then he didn't. So anyway, as it came on, he and I stayed together, and he came back to Fort Lauderdale. A lot of little incidents on the way. We'll cover those later. At Fort Lauderdale, he was assigned the same barracks with me, and we were flying with new crews. They put us there just checked us out and crossed us off as just already trained, so we flew with about anybody we wanted to, but we were assigned a crew. And so he was assigned to fly on this Bermuda Triangle. Now that's after the war had ended, and we were back there. And the war ended they dropped the bomb in August 6th of 45, and we both were due to stay there for about another year. We had what they called a kiddie cruise in the Navy. You couldn't get out until you were 21. You went in at 17. In his case, it's 15, so they didn't really know when to let him out. Anyway, I went with him down to the ad building, and we got all of that straightened out for him about 2 weeks before this Flight 19 incident happened. Now, the Flight 19 is just a normal training flight where you fly out to, you have your ammunition on board, and you fly out to the Hen and Chickens Islands, which is part of the Bermuda or Bimini chain. And when you get there, you bomb the big rock, and you got little small rocks off to the side, and you fire your weapons at those small rocks. And while we're talking about those, I want to tell you, I've done that a lot of times. And a little off the subject, but my son was a scuba diver after the war, after he got married in the 60s. And he was down here diving on those rocks. And he said when he was down there, he got a handful of spent 50 caliber rounds. Oh. And he brought those home for me, and he said, you reckon any of these are yours? And I said, no, none of them are mine. He said, why? I said, because I hit the rocks every time I fired. Well, what's a father going to say? Anyway, getting on to the story, the mission they were to fly was going out to the rocks. Then they fly about a 60-mile navigation leg out in the ocean, turn around, fly back to Fort Lauderdale, and 90 miles, something like that. And it's a normal mission, no problems to it. But he was flying with the lead airplane, and of course, in the middle of the afternoon, they took off, and then later that night, started hearing calls. A lot of people think this is all Navy, and it is 14 naval flyers missing. It was the headlines. Well, we had 3 crews of Marines, and like I say, there was two captains and 1 lieutenant. Their crew was mostly private first class, or the Marine ranks, lower Marine ranks. Probably the highest would be a lance corporal. And they had 8 of those, and then they had 1 who was a corporal at the time that didn't go. Now his experience, and all of these Marines had been overseas, and this one particular fellow's name I think was Parpart. But anyway, he was at Iwo Jima with the Marines, and of course we were out there patrolling, anti-sub patrol around there, and then we had probably 8-10 aircraft carriers out there bombing the place beforehand, and then being called in as the Marines wanted them to come in with dropping napalm and whatever on the mountain there, and then where the Japanese were holed up. So they saw these torpedo bombers coming in, dropping, and thought, that's a pretty good life, flying out there like that. They can go home and get a shave and do a lot of things. Not necessarily go home, but they go back to the carrier. And So when they got out of there, and most of them on that island, I'm sure they figured, if I ever get out of here, I'm certainly going to get out of the Corps, and I'm going to get out of the trenches. So these crews, they volunteered for torpedo bomber training, and they were taking a lot of them in. Now many of them didn't get to operate off aircraft carriers, but at islands they had to, some of them, or if we took an island, they could go in on the airstrip, and which happened later on Iwo Jima. The B-29s used their island. Well, those Marines, this one had shrapnel in his face, and he had poor breathing, and they passed him in his physical, which was okay, but every once in a while his nostrils and his sinuses would act up. And that day his sinuses were bad, so he decided not to fly. Went to the flight surgeon, and he was excused from the flight. So the other 8 Marines flew, and they were never heard of again. Now the lead aircraft gunner was my buddy Bob Harmon. The last time I saw him was that morning. I was walking off the flight line. They had a coffee shop out there near the flight line, and I got a cup of coffee and walking off, and he was coming out to fly, and he had a white Navy cap on, and he said, "Hey, Flip, let me borrow your ball cap." I had a green CB green cap. I loved that. And I sure enough tossed it to him, and he gave me his white hat, and never saw the hat again. But he, I think of that lots of times. When I look up, I can just visualize that hat coming down like a falling leaf.
Ah, that's sweet.
That's nice. But it won't be true, but it's just, you get ideas about things like that.
Yeah.
And the other crew now, the ensign and his crew, kind of feel sorry for them, because I'm sure they weren't briefed properly. They probably by somebody, but not by that pilot. And guys like that, maybe the 3rd or 4th flight for them to go out and not come back because of somebody's error is just inexcusable. And I really feel bad about that. Now with me, the first flight I took in the TBF, I wasn't briefed either. And I got on board, the pilot said, "Give them back, that's it." And I did, and I didn't know how to use the interphone. So I never spoke to him. And he chewed me out for not talking to him when we landed. Well, I didn't know where it was. But I found out in a hurry then.
Yes, you did.
But that's the difference between being a raw recruit and being a checked out flyer. And after years of experience, in that case, at least 2 solid years of training all the time. Now, I have my own ideas about this. It's a little difficult to discuss with some people, but I think the pilot, his pilot in that case, the leader of the flight, was probably a decent pilot and all that, but he was, to keep it kind of quiet, I'd say he had probably partaken of a few suds the night before.
Mm-hmm.
He was hungover, and he asked to get out of the flight, and they wouldn't let him get out of the flight for some reason. Anyway, he was not his normal self, which would have been instructor pilot responsible for 5 airplanes in the air. And it isn't normal for instructors to be in that condition. But anyway, this happened. So I think he was disoriented from the start. He flew out, made his takeoff, they lined up the airplanes, and they were flying south. But when you study about this, he was stationed at Opelika Naval Air Station near Miami, and just recently, within 30 days or so, he'd come up to Fort Lauderdale. And when you fly out of there, you get a different approach to the islands than you have when you fly out of Opelika, because otherwise you'll be in the Fort Lauderdale airspace, and you don't want to be that. You want to be in your Opelika assigned airspace. So I think he got confused and flew south, and he should have been flying north when he finished the business on the bombing business and gunnery on Hen and Chickens Island. Now, I can't prove this, but from the radio talk, he did sound south, and I think he being the instructor, would not let the other people in the flight make any decisions for him. He happened to be a Lieutenant JG. Three of the other pilots were Marine pilots. One a lieutenant, two of them captains. But they weren't experienced. They were all recruits as far as pilots and being well trained. Some accounts say they were well trained. The only well trained people on board were in the lead airplane. The pilot himself, my buddy the gunner, and the radio operator, of which he was a third-class petty officer, probably was quite well trained. I know that Bob Harmon, my buddy, had gone through intense training at Fort Lauderdale, more intense training with his squadron. He was stationed up at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, and even more at Barbers Point, Hawaii, where I met him. And we flew probably 4 flights a night there for a long time, from December of 44 through February of 45, and we had no problems at night. We were taught navigation, radar. Most crews I never taught that in those days because radar was fairly new. Celestial plottings of the universe, the stars and all that. We had good training. Normally you'd never get that. And certainly an enlistment. So we were quite valuable crews when you get down to it. The carrier Enterprise, where we were assigned, carrier Intrepid, and the carrier Saratoga were all assigned night crews. And this is when they operated. And most crews wouldn't have anything to do with that flying at night because it was pretty dangerous. I liked it because we were the only people up there. I considered it real safe.
But you weren't on an aircraft carrier, though.
A short while, yes.
Did you take and land on carrier?
We missed the takeoffs and landings on that. We got out there just at the time the kamikazes were getting thick. We got on board and we started out of the port, came back, and they decided
Lucky
to
you.
take the torpedo bombers off and put fighters on board
Gotcha.
because the kamikazes were so thick. So we were, but getting back to the flight 19, they flew out and came back. This is their account through radio reports that they didn't know where they were. They thought they were flying in the Gulf of Mexico at one time. They get mixed reports. Well, I can see where the students didn't know where they were for sure. And because they were Marine pilots, all Marines are well trained in taking orders. They weren't about to disobey any orders. So the lead pilot was telling them he knew where they were, and then all of a sudden he said, well, I don't know where we are. I think we're in the Gulf of Mexico, which would have been if he'd flown south over Bimini, turned left and started out that way. That's where then he saw some land. He figured over the Gulf of Mexico.
Have you listened to any of these radio transmissions and after that?
Only in the printed accounts.
Okay.
We didn't have any radio in the barracks
Ah,
here,
okay.
I think. But we did have a pilot take off from Fort Lauderdale and flew out to see if he could intercept them. But he couldn't make head or tail out of what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
He thought they were flying south. They thought they were flying north. And he kept telling them, I'm flying down to meet you and I'll bring you back. Put the sun on your left wing. Well, that never happened. I'm sure they thought they were flying in the Gulf of Mexico. You've got to come a different way, 180 degrees different to find land.
Yeah.
So I think that's what they did, was they listened to the pilot, the lead pilot, and I'm betting, but I'll never know, whether Bob Harmon had his plotting board with him, but he knew the area down there well, and he knew what to do. You can
But
fly.
he couldn't really say anything, could
There's
he?
no way he could talk to that lieutenant at that stage of the game, and not having the compasses and all that in his compartment. There was a remote compass in the radio compartment, but that wouldn't do you any good if you didn't know where you were
Right.
to start with. So I think it just got out of hand, and knowing that pilot, I had met him a few times, he was pretty firm in his, convinced he was good. He knew what he was doing. He was the instructor. I'm convinced that he let it get away from him due to his hangover.
Well, that's quite an interesting story, Johnny.
It's interesting and it's almost accusing, but you remember when you're losing people, it's not the time to dream up things.
Exactly.
You should say what you think is right and what you truly believe happened. And me having flown quite a bit for a young 19-year-old, I think it was appropriate to speak up.
Well, I admire the fact that since you lost a good friend, that you've been able to keep your mouth shut about it all this time and not make any accusations, but you're entitled to your opinions and your beliefs. Now, to your knowledge, have there been any other further incidents like that since that happened that have maybe not made the papers?
Oh yes, I got in the Air Force in 1948 and was flying in the B-36s, which we didn't have too many mysteries. We had a lot of crashes, and usually there's a reason. But when we got aerial tankers, there was a KC-135 missing down there in the triangle. Now, what would cause them to be missing? I would call it probably pilot error, or maybe a massive fuel leak. They're carrying a lot of gasoline. And I have flown in those KC-135s and in fact crashed in one of them. So I know they're survivable, but they're anything that is not pre-flighted properly, has a lot of fumes in the wing, should be caught by the ground crew or flight crew. Now that, on Flight 19 in the Bermuda Triangle, one of the airplanes going out to search for them was a PBM out of, which was then Banana River, Florida, Patrick Air Force Base now. It flew out and it blew up. Turned up missing, I'll say that. But it blew up, I'm sure. Maybe 15, 20 minutes after takeoff.
Yeah.
And a ship out there saw this explosion, but they didn't find anything when they went over that way to look at it. And of course, now I've flown in PBMs, and they're known as flying gas tanks in the Navy. And I know that if it got into the fuselage, and it could have, and blew there, it would blow the whole airplane up, because the engines weren't too far, two engines up on the wing. And like a PBY, but this was a PBM. And the difference being one of them built by Lockheed and one of them being built by Martin. Anyway, when you look at some of the incidents of the Bermuda Triangle, there's ships that were lost. There's very little found of those things. One ship was found with no crew on board, and apparently just everybody missing. Well, how could that happen? I don't know. Everybody went swimming.
Yeah, right, at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, it's all conjecture. You really don't know what happened. But with my experience in torpedo bombers and my experience with night flying, and it wasn't at night, they were running out of fuel before nightfall. And the fact that I thought the weather there be no question at all, we would find them. But who knows how they went in. The pilot said we're all going in together. I question that, because if you're trained, you probably would rather get off by yourself than everybody go in together. And if it comes to that stage, I would have encouraged my pilot to fly into the sun. That's the closer way to land. So you're going to run out of gas. Well, run out of gas closer to shore. And I can't imagine all of those people getting mixed up and not knowing that you got to go into the sun late in the afternoon to find Florida if you're out in the ocean. And to me, that's always been amazing that no one told him to, as we fondly put it in the Air Force, hang it in the ear, I'm going to go my way. And so my problem with that is that I was young, they were young, and I really don't know what happened, but I think my idea of this probably fits a solution as well as anything.
Very interesting, Johnny. I'm sure you have a lot of other interesting stories to tell that aren't connected with the Bermuda Triangle. That's a long career. And what did you retire as? What was your rank when you retired?
Senior Master Sergeant.
Senior Master Sergeant. That's too many stripes to count.
Yeah, 7 of them is a lot.
7 is a lot. Well, Johnny, one of the things I'd like everybody to remember is that while it's currently in favor to walk up to someone that you know has been in the service and say thank you for your service, we're mostly thinking of the young men today. But Johnny, Thank you for your service. It's been wonderful. You're a great guy. Thank you.
When you see a guy with his head held high, take a look at his Navy wings. 'Neath a coat of blue beats a heart that's true to the code of